Hi, team. So we had three readings this week that Justin and I are going to discuss, and we'll have an open discussion, and then we'll toss it back to Yellow Dig for continuing questions. So one of the chapters that we looked at was a reading called The Data That Turned the World Upside Down. So as you remember, Justin, this was the article that was about utilizing a personality profile that's developed about you based on your digital footprint. So this was taking information that they had gathered on what you buy, on where you go, what you do, what you say online, and creating a personality profile for it. So then they were using this information to develop targeted marketing for you. And it turns out they were using this very specifically in the most recent presidential campaign. And so instead of doing broad spread marketing television campaigns, they were going digital and they were bringing it to you based on their personality profile of you and your specific preferences to target you and to make their candidate seem more appealing to you based on what they know of you. So let's discuss that, and we can talk about the ethics and the privacy concerns related to that activity and big data. So what do you think?
Well, I think we've all seen politicians that will tend to customize their message and talk to their audience to try to tell them what they want to hear. By using this world that turned the data upside down, the way that they customize their messages, they can send personalized messages directly to people through Facebook ads or whatever it is that's not necessarily broad in nature. So you don't really see what the candidate wants. You're seeing what the candidate wants you to hear. And so if they're looking at your Facebook post and they've figured out your personality profile, they know that you go to church on Sunday. They know that you have, you're a gun owner. They know that you don't like this or that. They can customize ads specific to you and their political message to you, and not necessarily as a whole. So it kind of confuses the message and whether or not the candidate really believes what they're doing because they have to say it out in the open, or whether or not they're just telling you what you want to hear.
I would tend to agree. It seems like such an opportunity from the candidate's perspective to really target your marketing dollars in the areas where they'll have the most impacts. So, from that perspective, it seems to make sense from using that data. But at the same time, are we making erroneous assumptions about people? Are we using information without their permission in ways that they didn't anticipate? So, from that perspective, it seems pretty scary to me. And so I think it could have some violations from an ethics perspective or from a privacy perspective.
Yeah, the part of customizing the message and targeting their campaign dollars, when you're dealing with something like Google AdWords or Facebook ads, you can target those to specific zip codes. And so rather than getting your message out across a state or across the entire country, you can target specific swing zip codes, and making sure that you're really not even talking to 2/3 of the country. You're talking to the bit that really is going to determine the election. So yeah, good point. Good point.
Very interesting. Well, should we move on to the second reading,
Yeah.
which was the weapons of mass destruction?
Yeah, the weapons of math destruction is one of our readings. Our assignment this week was to read the first 13 pages of the introduction, and I think the weapons of math destruction kind of provides an antagonistic view of sorts of the big data industry. In the readings that we did, it highlights the experiences of a school teacher that worked in Washington, D.C. She taught fifth grade, and they came out with a program in Washington, D.C. to be able to evaluate the teachers and to be able to get the teachers that were underperforming out of the system. And they would use standardized test scores from year to year to year, even at the beginning of the year to the end of the year, to evaluate these teachers. And um, the school district hired a company, I think in the Midwest, to go through and create these algorithms to determine how they were going to evaluate the teachers. And so the particular subject of the of the readings was the school teacher who was getting tremendous reviews. She was engaging with her students really well. Her principal loved her. The other instructors loved her. But at the end, she ended up getting a failing grade and ended up getting fired. And she started asking questions. Why did I get fired? I'm getting really great scores from everybody. Everybody seemed to like me. Nobody could answer the question on how the algorithm worked because it was a contract that came out of the Midwest. The programmers had long since moved on. Nobody could really answer her question of what happened. And then when it came down to reviewing some of the test scores, they found that some of the test scores from the students from the previous year showed signs of being manipulated. And so you have these fourth grade students that may have had the teachers going in and fixing answers to make the teachers look better, but in the end, it sets the fifth grade teacher up for failure. Luckily, the teacher that was being made an example here was able to move on to a better school district that truly took advantage of her skills and abilities. So it ended well for her, but it highlights a lot of great points of over-reliance upon data and not being able to understand where your algorithms are coming from. So what jumped out to you when you were reading through that section?
For me, I was horrified to find that when she challenged the results of those algorithms, they wouldn't explain them to her. They were either saying that they were too complex to describe and she wouldn't understand, or they were saying it was proprietary information. And so, though she was being evaluated based on that information and a career decision was made on her behalf based on that information, there was no transparency in what really produced that result or that outcome. She discovered that the tests were apparently altered from their prior class through other means, and it wasn't through this inquiry involved in how the data actually came about. And so that's truly horrifying that you can have a decision made on your behalf without ever understanding where that comes from. And that was truly horrifying for me.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people can probably resonate through performance reviews. A lot of people go through performance reviews, and the bigger the business or the organization, the more standardized the performance review is going to be, and whether or not we're truly introducing human elements into those factors and scores.
That's right. And the other thing that the reading highlighted was it's intended to take out bias. So if you have a principal that has a preference for a certain teacher, they could, through other instruments, give them a better review. But the data is supposed to take the subjectivity out of it and make it more objective. But it also highlighted that the people that are programming those systems probably have a bias. As we've kind of discovered in some of our other classes, we have these underlying biases that we ourselves may not even be aware of, that you could unintentionally program into your algorithms and your data analytics. And that was pretty shocking too, and something to be aware of with big data.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so our third reading, Eye in the Sky.
So this one was particularly fascinating. This was a podcast that was done that discussed, really, they had a gentleman that was involved in the military, and he developed a tool using students at a military academy to generate a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, that would take photographs of the land over Fallujah. And so they were experiencing these incidents with these roadside bombings, and they wanted to determine who had perpetrated these bombings, who had set these bombs that were harming our troops. And so they developed this software where it would surveil the area and it would take pictures on regular increments. And so when an incident occurred, they could go back to those pictures, and then they could find when a vehicle arrived on the scene, planted that bomb, and then they would track it forward to see where it went so that they could then go track down the perpetrators and hold them accountable. So he's adapted this technology and brought it to the US. And so he's looking at marketing it towards the public safety in the US. And so the podcast walked through an opportunity that they had actually in another country to really to find somebody, one that had perpetrated a theft at someone's house, a burglary while they weren't home. And so they tracked it back after they saw the aerial footage. And then they also actually tracked down someone who had murdered a police officer. And so they promoted this amongst numbers of cities and towns in Ohio in the US. But when they took it to the city council, they had mixed reviews from the stakeholders. So Generally, a third were in support of it, a third were indifferent, and a third were very adamantly opposed. And so we could talk through what that looked like and what your thoughts and impressions are on the Eye in the Sky podcast. It was fascinating.
Yeah, definitely. And I think anybody that's been to a town hall meeting or a city council meeting, that kind of stuff, there's always going to be that audience out there that truly doesn't understand what's going on. And I think just in general, as human beings, I think we fear what we don't understand. And so, even with the presentation, with Ross McNutt, the military guy, he went to the ACLU. He contacted all of these privacy organizations. He wanted to make it very clear that the cameras were basically showing people as pixels. I mean, you couldn't see what they were wearing. You couldn't see what nationality they were, what racial background. You couldn't tell any of that. I mean, these pictures were being taken from 10,000 feet in the air. But when it came down to it, there was a lot of people that were concerned about what the information was going to be used for, because all of a sudden they've lost control of their personal data. Whether or not that they're going to be tracked going to school, whether or not the data could be used by, could go through a public Freedom of Information Act to acquire that information and maybe track down an ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend, or see if what your spouse is doing on the weekends, that kind of stuff. And so there was a lot of, I guess, fear associated with what the information could be used for.
I found that interesting too. It is difficult to understand how the information would be used and even what it looks like if you're not actually participating in one of these investigations, say. And like you said, he intended for it to be at the pixel level, but as a member of the public, you always have to wonder, is there an opportunity to zoom in? Is there an opportunity to drill in and see more than they claim they can see? Can they bury that in the fine print of the disclosure somewhere? Even though they say they won't do it, could they still if they chose to? And so something to be aware of with respect to the ethics and privacy of something like that. And so it seems like a great instrument to be able to track down those who would murder a police officer, but at the same time, what other civil liberties might be violated. It's scary. It's a concern.
Yeah, definitely. And some of those concerns are founded. Because I think this kind of gets into one of the big overarching situations that we need to deal with when it comes to ethics and privacy, is there's really not a lot of really great rules in the United States right now for how that data is to be handled, how it's to be made secure. Even if if it was acquired by the government, is there public access to it? Could you acquire that information by doing a Freedom of Information Act request? So I think at least moving on to takeaways, my biggest takeaway from our readings is that we have a long way to go to be able to make sure that there's some public trust in big data. I think the more that we look into it, the more we realize we're giving out more data than we realize. The European Union, and the European Union is not to be modeled for everything, but the European Union they have put together the General Data Protection Regulation. And they established this General Data Protection Regulation across all of the European Union, and it is very, very sound in what people can collect data for, what they can use data for, how they're supposed to secure it so that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. They've established really strict penalties for the misuse of the data or for data breaches. They can fine somebody up to 20 million euros or 4% of their annual global turnover. And so it is huge. When we get back to something like the Eye in the Sky, a lot of these residents are concerned about what their data is going to happen, what's going to happen to their data. You see messages in stores that there's a camera may be watching you, or a video surveillance is in effect. You might get a phone call that says this is being recorded for quality assurance or whatever it is going to be. but there's not a lot of information that says that the video and your voice from phone calls or whatever it's going to be isn't being tied back to other data that organization may already have about you, and what they're doing with that data to try to either manipulate messages or deliver sales or what's going on with that. I don't think people are ready to have all of that out there yet. So passing it over to you, what is your big takeaway from the readings we did this week?
I think that the collectors of this information should be very conscientious in how they're collecting it and how they're using it. Going back to the example from the teacher, it should be very important that we talk about what this means. So it's not the only element that's used to make a decision on someone's employment.
Absolutely.
Knowing that there could be biases and there could be flawed approaches. I think it's important that we continue to revisit our use of the data. And so if they do find there's inherent biases or there's inherent flaws, we should be monitoring that and then making adjustments as needed if they find that to be the case. I think it's also important in the case of the individuals that were using this for election advertising. A lot of companies put in their disclosures that they may share your information with third parties, and they often say may. Perhaps they should say they will, and then they should say how they will share it and how they will use that information and with whom they will share it. And so you sign away your rights when you allow them to do that, but they don't often go into detail. And so you might not know what that means. You might just think that that means you're going to get more mailers, you're going to get more information via snail mail, but that's not really the case anymore. And I think we should do more to better disclose how that information will be used.
Great. Any last takeaways before we sign off?
I think that's it for now.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Hope you enjoyed our discussion.